Hey, OCA historians. Coach Thompson here, and I'm going to be going way outside my comfort zone today for this video. This is a video which we're going to take and talk about Renaissance, yes, but we're going to talk about the art of the Renaissance and how the art of the Renaissance actually illustrates one of the main ideas of the Renaissance, and that is the idea of humanism. And so today, again, in as good a form as I can, I'm going to explain to you illustrate to you some artistic things that show the humanism and just the general cultural attitude that was the Renaissance. So when we're talking about the Renaissance, what exactly are we talking about? Well, and we talk about humanism, what are we talking about? Well, as we've said before, humanism really is this idea of man is the measure of all things. We shouldn't be fooled into thinking that humanism is necessarily atheistic or even anti-God for that matter. What humanism does is it shifts the focus, though, from God as creator or redeemer, as the source of authority, and it shifts it to man and the potential of man, the achievements of man, which is obviously not really totally false. Now, this comes down in a number of ways, some of which we'll see this in the artwork, but we'll also see it just in the kinds of things that people studied permanently and in society. So, for example, whereas the scholastics, Anselm and Abelard and even Thomas Aquinas studied theological things for the most part, humanism and the Renaissance began to study other things that concern man himself, literature, history, what had man done? And as we're going to see here in a minute, art, what does man create? An interesting quote from Shakespeare, who's really from this time, as you read, said this in Hamlet. He says, "What a piece of work is man! How noble is reason! How infinite in faculty, in form and moving, how express and admirable, in action, how like an angel." It's a pretty high view of man. In some ways, it's not that far from what you would see in Psalm 8, which I would kind of invite you to take a look at. And yet there's really a focus on man and what man can do. Well, by way of comparison, what did medieval art look like? Well, here's a piece of artwork that was made, and I just want to point out a couple of things. One is that it's very flat and two-dimensional. You can't really see any sort of depth. It's all just on one level. Facial expressions, proportions of people, how people are standing, and they're literally standing on each other's feet. The skill level was not good. The subject matter is very purely spiritual. This is Mary coming to the disciples to tell them that Jesus has written. You would think you might see a little bit more expression and emotion on the faces, but that's not to be. This is medieval art. It was art that was focused on a spiritual thing. And it was done at a time when it really wasn't that much of a skill that people had. Things began to change. For example, the subject began to change. This is a picture of somebody who's mentioned in your book, one of the Medicis. The Medicis were a famous family, everything from rich merchants to civic leaders to popes came from this family. And Lorenzo Medici, also known as El Magnifico, had this painting done. Now, this particular painting was done by a man by the name of Bronzino. We'll talk about some other famous artists later on. But you notice there's no spiritual aspect to this at all. This is simply a painting of a picture. And it's kind of a case of a man, and it's kind of a matter of he who pays the piper calls the tune. And this is a portrait of Lorenzo. Actually, it was made after his death. Typically, these paintings tend to be pretty flattering in one way or another. But this is a painting that's made for an individual, in essence, to honor and glorify an individual. And so this is pretty common stuff. patrons would pay to have paintings done of them, or to be included in paintings, and they were done for their purposes, whatever those might be. Now, the other thing about subject matter is that, again, as the Renaissance did, it had a great reverence, really, for the classics, for Rome and Greece. This painting by a man by the name of Raphael, not a turtle, but a man, is called The School of Athens. And I wish I could zoom in on it a little bit, but you see all these people. Now you'll see many of the same kinds of things we're going to talk about later in terms of three-dimensional, in terms of light, in terms of skill, in terms of subject matter, all shown in this painting. If you focus on the center of the painting, you see two men. One of them, the one on the left, whose hand seems to be pointing skyward, is Plato. And as you know, Plato focused on sort of a spiritual world, not a physical world, but a spiritual, sort of philosophical world of forms and shapes. And on the side there with Plato are a whole number of people from history, some of them from the classics, some of them honestly from the Bible, who kind of fall into that category. People have actually done maps of exactly who each one of these people are, and we don't really have time to do that, but you could do that if you ever had time. On the right, you have another man, a younger man, as he was in real life, and that's Aristotle. And Aristotle's hand is more focused on the ground, it's more focused on the earth, and the men standing around on his side, again, some people know who they are, the scholars know who they are talking about earthly things, practical things, material things. You have all this knowledge right here. And as the Renaissance tended to do, they looked back at the Greeks and the Romans, and they saw that as the place where knowledge was. And they saw themselves as the rebirth of that civilization. Now, you've already seen this to a certain extent, and I'm not sure in some ways this is the greatest painting, but this is one that actually had the lines on it, so I went ahead and borrowed this. And that's the ability for painters, all right, in this case, a man by the name of Brunels, to portray and to paint distance, perspective, depth, three-dimensional. And he's done this here with a painting of, obviously, this is intended to be Jesus, and he's talking to disciples, people all around, and you can probably speculate on exactly what this is about. You'll notice that most of these men are not really dressed in biblical garb. Okay, the short leggings of some of the men is obviously a Renaissance thing. They're not trying to be spiritually accurate. They're just using this as a subject to paint about. But you'll see the skill that starts to come in. Skill, by the way, which the Greeks and the Romans had, but that the medieval artists really didn't have much. Another example is a man by the name of Caravaggio, and he painted this painting, which honestly is, you wouldn't guess it from looking at it, it's the calling of St. Matthew, and doesn't time-wise, appearance-wise, any other way, matching with the story-wise, it's really not that. It's just, again, it's a topic to paint about, and then you kind of do what you do. And what he does here is that he shows the ability of the medieval or the Renaissance artist to paint light and shadow. It's a skill. It's a skill that man now has developed as a creative person. Man has that kind of skill. And now, more and more in the Renaissance, spiritual topics are just topics to paint about, not necessarily to show a spiritual truth, but oftentimes to show the skill of the artist. And you see that in this particular painting. One of the famous artists of the Renaissance is a man by the name of Michelangelo. And we could spend time and time and time on him, even with what little I know about what's going on. Now, this sculpture, you'll see that they didn't just do paintings, they also did sculptures. There's an incredible sculpture called a Pietà. And actually, he did a number of Pietas. It was just, again, a spiritual theme. In this case, it's a theme of Mary holding the body of the crucified Jesus, her son. What's interesting here is that there's some ideas from the church and from Renaissance itself kind of built into this painting. It's hard to see from this, but if you looked at the actual painting, what you would find is that Mary is considerably larger than Jesus. Even though Jesus by this time was a grown man in his 30s, his mother was far bigger than him. I think to some degree that shows there was an emphasis on Mary that was there, not just in the medieval church, but also in the Renaissance church. Another thing, and I don't know that it's on this particular Pietà, but it might be on another one, is another one that Michelangelo did, was there actually was a sash across Mary's chest that said, Michelangelo did this. Which points out another thing I want to make clear about the Renaissance artists, and that is this. Renaissance artists, unlike medieval artists, and even artists sometimes from before, were famous in their own right. And much of what they did was for fame, probably not for money, for large wealth all the time, but certainly for fame and to exhibit their skill. And oftentimes they actually built and worked into their works individual personalities, sometimes even themselves. And Michelangelo was known to do this. One of the famous kind of humorous examples of this had to do with Michelangelo doing the Sistine Chapel. And as he did the Sistine Chapel, like any building project that was going on there in St. Peter's Basilica, some of the priests and the functionaries in the Vatican wanted him to go faster, and they frustrated him because he was an artist and he was trying to do this exactly the way that he wanted to do it. And he became so frustrated with this particular individual that he actually put him into the painting, and he put him in an interesting way. Well, I'm not sure if you've ever seen the whole Sistine Chapel, but it's this huge, really spectrum of artwork. And one of the things is a judgment. And in one part of this judgment, there are people that are being sent to heaven. And in another part of this painting, there are those who are condemned to hell. And they're in a boat and they're floating down the stream to eternal damnation. And what Michelangelo did with this individual who he was frustrated with is he simply painted one of those individuals as this particular priest. Sense of humor? Yes. Bitterness? Yeah, probably. But it just shows that the artists themselves now became a part of the painting. They became a part of the story. So you see the focus on man, the change in the subject matter, the technical abilities, the actual fame and skill of individual artists, all sort of illustrate humanism. And they illustrate the way that the Renaissance had worked its way into artwork.